The air in the community hall was a tired concoction of memories and disinfectants. It smelled of pine from a tinsel-choked tree in the corner, a scent fighting a losing battle against decades of stale coffee and damp wool coats. Overhead, long fluorescent tubes hummed a weary, insectal tune, casting a sterile white light on the mountains of cardboard boxes and the chaotic cheer of the annual toy drive for tots. The walls, painted a hopeful but now chipped mint green, were adorned with children's drawings of lopsided Santas and reindeer with too many legs. It was a place built on good intentions and shoestring budgets. At a small, scarred card table near the back, an old man sat alone. His name was Arthur Vance. He was a creature of stillness in a room buzzing with the low-grade panic of last-minute charity. His back was straight, a ramrod of discipline softened by the slump of 80 years. His hands, gnarled and mapped with the pale tributaries of old scars, moved with a watchmaker's deliberate grace. He was repairing a small wooden train, its cheerful red paint flaked away, one of its tiny wheels splintered. He held a sliver of wood and a miniature file, his movements economical, precise. There was no wasted motion. His face was a landscape of a long life, etched with lines that spoke not of laughter, but of weather, of squinting in his suns and snows most people only read about. His eyes, a pale and washed-out blue, were fixed on his work. They held the deep, placid calm of a frozen lake. He wore a simple, faded flannel shirt and a worn, dark green field jacket, the kind of garment that had long ago molded itself to the shape of its owner. He was an island of quiet in an ocean of noise. Then the front doors swung open, letting in a belligerent gust of frigid December air. The sudden cold was a physical blow, silencing the nearest conversations. 3 young men sauntered in. They did not belong. Their presence was a tear in the room's fragile fabric of goodwill. The one in the lead, Jax, moved with the liquid arrogance of a predator entering a petting zoo. He was tall, built with the lean, hard muscle of youth, his face set in a permanent sneer. His expensive jacket and pristine sneakers were an insult to the worn linoleum floor. His 2 companions were shadows, reflections of his own smug confidence, their eyes darting around the room, cataloging weakness. Jax's gaze swept over the volunteers, dismissing them. He saw nervous smiles and averted eyes. He saw fear. It was a currency he understood better than money. His eyes finally landed on the metal lockbox on the main donation table, a fat, promising square of steel. A smirk played on his lips. This was going to be easy. He swaggered toward the table, his friends fanning out behind him, a casual, practiced intimidation. His internal monologue was a drumbeat of contempt. Look at these people, playing Santa for a world that doesn't care, wasting their time while he was out there taking what was his. He felt a surge of power, the familiar thrill of control. His path took him past Arthur's small table. He stopped. He looked down at the old man, at the gray head bent over the ridiculous little toy. The sight was an affront to his sense of importance. Playing with dolls, Grandpa? Jax's voice sliced through the nervous quiet. It was loud, filled with a jagged, mocking edge. Arthur did not look up. His hands remained perfectly steady. He fitted the tiny, repaired wheel onto the train's axle, his focus absolute. The silence that followed Jax's question was heavier than the words themselves. Jax's smirk tightened. He hated being ignored. It was a challenge to his authority. "Hey, I'm talking to you," he said, his voice lower, more dangerous. Slowly, as if surfacing from a great depth, Arthur finished his task. He spun the tiny wheel. It turned smoothly. Only then did he lift his head. His pale blue eyes met Jax's dark, angry ones. There was no fear in them. There was no anger. There was nothing but a calm, patient observation, as if he were studying an interesting but predictable species of insect. "This is for the children," Arthur said. His voice was a low gravel, a sound like stones tumbling in a slow river. It was not a plea. It was a statement of fact. The simplicity of it infuriated Jax. He had expected trembling, pleading, a frantic scramble to appease him. This old man's stillness was a quiet act of defiance that his ego could not tolerate. The children, Jax laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. The children ain't getting nothing. Not tonight. He turned to the main table and gestured at the lockbox. I'll be taking the cash, and maybe a few of the nicer toys for myself. Across the room, a young volunteer named Maria watched, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She was 17, here for community service hours, and utterly terrified. But as she looked at Arthur, a different feeling began to surface beneath the fear. Indignation. She saw the way Jax postured, the way his friend smirked, and it made her sick. Then she looked back at the old man. He hadn't moved. He just sat there, watching. His posture was relaxed, yet alert. It was the most unnatural calm she had ever seen. It wasn't the resignation of an old man accepting his fate. It was the patience of something ancient and powerful. Jax's frustration was boiling over. This wasn't going according to script. The old man was supposed to be the catalyst for fear, the first one to break and send the rest of them scrambling. Instead, he was an anchor of calm, holding the room in a state of tense paralysis. What are you going to do, old-timer? Jax sneered, stepping closer to Arthur's table. Bore me to death with your stories about the good old days. He reached out and, with a flick of his wrist, swept a handful of miniature tools and wood shavings off the table. They scattered across the floor with a pathetic clatter. Arthur's gaze followed the tools, then returned to Jax's face. His expression did not change. You should leave, Arthur said, his voice still quiet, still level. This was a mistake. For Jax, this was the final insult. An order. From Miss Fossil. I'll leave when I have what I came for, Jax snarled. He kicked the leg of the card table. The little wooden train wobbled, but didn't fall. Give me the key to the box, old man. Now. Arthur's hands rested on the tabletop, palms down. They were perfectly still. Not a tremor. Maria noticed it, and a strange thought flickered through her mind. Her own grandfather had Parkinson's. His hands shook constantly. This man was older, yet he possessed a stillness that was absolute. It was the stillness of a statue. Jax saw the stillness too, and it was like gasoline on the fire of his rage. Weakness should tremble. Age should defer. This man was breaking all the rules. His eyes fell on the faded fabric of Arthur's old jacket. Tucked near the collar was a small, grimy patch, its insignia worn away to a meaningless collection of threads. It was barely noticeable, a ghost of some long-forgotten allegiance. Without thinking, driven by a need to provoke, to get any reaction, Jax reached out and ripped the patch from the jacket. The sound of tearing fabric was shockingly loud in the silent room. He held the small piece of cloth between his thumb and forefinger. What's this, Grandpa? He mocked, holding it up. You some kind of hero? From the dinosaur wars. He dangled it in front of Arthur's face. What was your call sign, huh? Sergeant Slow-Mo? Captain Catnap. The word hung in the air. Call sign. For the first time, something shifted in Arthur's eyes. The frozen lake thawed, just for a second, and revealed a depth that was terrifying. The room, the lights, the smell of pine, it all fell away. He is not here. He is somewhere else. The air is thin, razor-sharp, and tastes of metal. Snow is falling, thick and silent, each flake a tiny shroud. The trees are skeletal, black fingers clawing at a bruised purple sky. The only sound is the whisper of his own breathing, misting in the brutal cold, and the soft crunch of his boots in the deep powder. The weight of the rifle in his hands is a familiar comfort, an extension of his own bones. He can smell cordite on the wind, and the faint, sweet scent of pine sap from a wounded tree. He is alone, miles behind a line that no longer exists. A voice crackles in his ear, a ghost in the machine, tinny and distant. Status, Silent Night. What is your status? He doesn't answer. Answering is noise. Noise is death. His mission is not to talk. His mission is to move through this white, frozen hell without a sound, a phantom in the storm. He is the one they send when there is no one else. He is the one who brings the silence. The memory lasted only a heartbeat, but it changed him. When his eyes refocused on Jax, the calm was still there, but it was different now. It was heavier, colder. It was the calm at the eye of a hurricane. Maria saw it. She saw the shift, the infinitesimal tightening of the muscles around his jaw, the sudden, profound weariness in his gaze. It wasn't fear. It was sorrow. And it was the most frightening thing she had ever seen. This has gone too far. Her terror was finally overcome by a surge of desperate resolve. She backed away slowly, her movements hidden by a large stack of boxes. Her hands, unlike Arthur's, were shaking violently as she pulled her phone from her pocket. Her eyes darted to the wall by the entrance. There was a bronze plaque there, listing the patrons of the community center. At the top, under founding benefactor, was a name, General Harrison Wallace, retired. Beneath, it was a phone number for his foundation. She had always thought it was just for show. Her fingers fumbled on the screen, her breath catching in her throat. She pressed the number and lifted the phone to her ear, praying someone would answer. Jax, oblivious, was high on his own power. He had finally gotten a reaction, a flicker of something in the old man's eyes. He felt victorious. He dropped the torn patch on the floor and ground it under his heel. Look at that. Nothing but dust. He leaned in close, his voice a venomous whisper. Now for the last time. The key. To punctuate his demand, he reached out and grabbed the front of Arthur's jacket, bunching the worn fabric in his fist. He pulled the old man forward, half out of his chair. I'm talking to you. The physical contact was the crossing of a final, invisible line. It was a mistake that would unravel his entire world. At that exact moment, the main doors of the community hall burst open with such force that they slammed against the inside walls. The sound was like a gunshot. Every head snapped toward the entrance. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the dark, snowy night, was a tall, broad-shouldered man in a tailored overcoat. Even without a uniform, his bearing was unmistakably military. His hair was silver, cut with severe precision. His face was granite, and his eyes were chips of ice. Flanking him were two uniformed police officers, their faces grim, their hands resting near their sidearms. It was General Harrison Wallace. The atmosphere in the room didn't just shift. It shattered. The air crackled with a new, terrifying authority. The low hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to fall silent. Time itself seemed to hold its breath. Jax froze. His hand was still clenched in Arthur's jacket. He stared at the figures in the doorway, his mind struggling to process the sudden, overwhelming change in the power dynamic. He didn't know who this man was, but he recognized power when he saw it. And this was power of a kind he had never encountered. General Wallace's icy gaze swept the room, taking in the scene with a glance. He saw the terrified volunteers. He saw the smirking thugs. He saw Jax with his hand on the old man's collar. His eyes narrowed to dangerous slits. He completely ignored Jax. He walked past him as if he were a piece of furniture. His heavy, polished shoes clicked on the linoleum, each step an indictment. The two officers followed, their presence radiating a quiet menace that made Jax's loud intimidation seem childish and pathetic. The general stopped directly in front of Arthur's table. He looked down at the old man, who was still being held by the stunned Jax. The general's expression, which had been one of cold fury, softened instantly. A look of profound, almost reverent respect washed over his features. He stood at attention. He brought his heels together with an audible, sharp click that echoed in the dead silence. Then, with a motion that was fluid, precise, and filled with a lifetime of discipline, General Harrison Wallace, a man who had commanded armies and advised presidents, rendered a slow, perfect salute to the frail old man in the flannel shirt. His hand was a rock. His gaze was unwavering. "Colonel Vance," the general's voice boomed, clear and strong, resonating with an authority that left no room for argument. "It is an honor to see you again, sir." The word "sir" hung in the air, a stunning, world-altering bomb. Jax's hand fell away from Arthur's jacket, as if the fabric had suddenly become white-hot. His mind reeled. "Colonel, sir." He stared, his mouth agape, from the ramrod-straight general to the unassuming old man. It didn't make sense. Arthur slowly, almost painfully, rose to his feet. He gave a slight, tired nod to the general. "Harrison," he said, his voice a quiet rasp. "You shouldn't have." The general kept his salute locked in place. He did not look at Arthur. Instead, he turned his head, his cold, furious eyes locking onto Jax. Every person in the room felt the temperature drop another 20 degrees. "You," the general began, his voice dangerously low, a growl rumbling beneath the surface. "Do you have any idea who you are putting your filthy hands on?" Jax was paralyzed, his bravado stripped away, leaving only a pale, twitching fear. He shook his head, unable to speak. "Of course you don't," the general continued, his voice rising with each word, a controlled crescendo of righteous fury. "You look at him, and you see an old man. You see a victim. You see weakness. Your kind always does." He paused, letting the weight of his contempt settle on Jax like a physical shroud. "Let me tell you who you see." The general's voice filled the hall, every word a hammer blow of truth. "You see Colonel Arthur Vance of the United States Army Special Forces, a man who holds 3 silver stars, 2 Purple Hearts, and the Distinguished Service Cross. A man who has served his country in 3 wars, on 5 continents, in places you couldn't find on a map." He took a step toward Jax, who flinched back. "This man, who you called Grandpa, led a team on a high-altitude, low-opening jump into the heart of a blizzard behind enemy lines to rescue a platoon that had been written off for dead. He carried a wounded man on his back for 2 days through waist-deep snow and active enemy patrols to get him to safety." The story fell into the stunned silence of the room. The volunteers, Maria, even Jax's own cronies, stared at Arthur with newfound awe. Arthur himself just stood there, his face weary, as if the recounting of his own history was a burden he was forced to bear. "But his medals and his missions," the general went on, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "they aren't what made him a legend. He earned a different name among the people who truly matter, to the men he saved, and to the enemies who had the misfortune of standing in his way. He was known by another name." The general leaned in until he was inches from Jax's face. "They called him the Silent Knight." The name seemed to suck the very air from the room. It sounded mythical. Impossible. "They called him that," the general explained, his voice hard as diamond, "because he could move through the darkest corners of the world without making a sound. He was a ghost, a whisper in the shadows. He brought salvation to his men and a quiet, sudden end to our enemies. He has faced down battalions. He has survived things that would make a monster like you weep for your mother." He finally lowered his salute, his hand dropping to his side. He straightened his coat. His full, undivided attention was now on Jax, and it was a terrible thing to behold. "And you," the general said, his voice now utterly devoid of emotion, which was somehow more terrifying than the anger. "You chose to threaten him. You chose to put your hands on him. Here, in a place of charity, while he was fixing a toy for a child." The general looked at Jax with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. "You are a special kind of coward. You are a parasite who feeds on the goodness of others. You are a footnote, an embarrassment, a piece of filth on the boot of a great man." He turned to the 2 police officers, who had been watching the entire exchange with grim satisfaction. "Officers," the general commanded, "arrest this garbage. Attempted robbery of a charitable organization. Assault. Menacing. I want every charge that can possibly stick. I will provide a statement, and I will personally be present at his arraignment to ensure the district attorney understands the gravity of this offense." The officers moved with brisk efficiency. One of them grabbed Jax's arm and twisted it behind his back with practiced ease. The click of the handcuffs locking was the loudest sound in the room. Jax's face was a mask of disbelief and terror. His entire world, built on a foundation of cheap intimidation, had crumbled to dust in less than 5 minutes. His two friends, seeing their leader so utterly and completely dismantled, had already begun to back toward the door, their faces pale. "Them too," the general said without looking at them. The second officer intercepted them before they could flee. As they were being led away, cuffed and humiliated, Jax looked back at Arthur one last time. He was looking for something, an answer, an explanation. But Arthur's face showed nothing but a deep, profound pity. The disgraced young men were marched out into the cold night, the slamming door of a police car, their final contribution to the evening. The tension in the room broke. People began to breathe again. A few of the volunteers started to clap, a scattered, hesitant applause that grew into a wave of grateful, astonished sound. The general turned back to Arthur, his expression softening once more. "Arthur," he said, his voice filled with concern. "I'm so sorry you had to endure that." The moment Maria called, Arthur held up a hand, silencing him. He looked toward the door through which Jax had disappeared. "He's just a boy, Harrison," Arthur said, his voice a low rumble. "Lost in the noise, trying to sound loud because he's afraid of the silence." It was a moment of grace so profound it silenced the applause. He offered no anger, no satisfaction in the young man's downfall. Only a quiet, sad understanding. He then bent down and carefully picked up the little wooden train from the table. He walked over to Maria, who was standing by the boxes, her eyes wide with tears and awe. He held out the train to her. "Make sure this gets to a good home," he said gently. She took it, her fingers brushing against his scarred, steady hand. "Thank you, sir," she whispered, the word "sir" feeling entirely new in her mouth. Arthur gave her a small, tired smile. He turned, retrieved his simple coat, and walked toward the door. The crowd of volunteers instinctively parted for him, creating a silent, respectful aisle. "Arthur, wait," the general called out. "Let me give you a ride." Arthur paused at the door, turning back. "The walk will do me good, Harrison. I prefer the quiet." He stepped out into the night, into the gently falling snow, and was gone. He disappeared as silently as he had lived, leaving behind a silence in the room that was louder and more meaningful than all the noise that had come before. In the weeks that followed, the story of what happened at the community center became a quiet local legend. Jax and his friends, facing a mountain of charges and the unwavering testimony of a 4-star general, received the maximum possible sentences. During the sentencing, the judge spoke at length about the concept of hidden valor and the debt owed to a generation whose sacrifices were too often forgotten. The toy drive, buoyed by the sudden publicity, received a flood of donations, more than enough to ensure every child in the city had a gift that year. General Wallace, true to his word, worked with the city council and the police department. A new community outreach program was established, designed to train officers in identifying and assisting veterans who were struggling with civilian life. They called it the Vance Initiative. Arthur Vance was never seen at the community center again. He took no credit. He wanted no accolades. His work was done. Sometimes, on a cold winter night, when the snow fell in a thick, silencing blanket over the city, people would think of him. They would think of the quiet old man who had faced down an army of shadows, only to be confronted by the petty angers of the modern world. Far away, in a small, neat house on a quiet street, Arthur Vance sat in a worn armchair by a window. A small lamp cast a warm, golden glow over his gnarled hands. He held a fresh block of pine wood and a small, sharp knife. He was carving a new toy, a little wooden soldier. Outside, the snow fell, burying the world in a pristine, peaceful white. The city was loud, full of sirens and shouting, of anger and ambition. But in this room, there was only the soft scrape of the blade against the wood, a sound of creation, of patience, of peace. for the man they called the Silent Night. The greatest peace was found not in the thunder of glory, but in the quiet work of a humble heart.